In this episode, we are going to hear 3 stories from people who met up with strange creatures and mysterious and supernatural beings in forests across the United States. The first story comes to us from upstate New York in July of 2000. It was a hot summer day in July of 2000. I was living in New York at the time, just north of Albany. This was the year right before my family moved to Pennsylvania. I was 16 and my cousin was 18, and that day her boyfriend, and I were heading to a lake near her house to swim. So after lunch, we got in her car to start heading there. It was about a 45-minute drive from her house to the lake. Neither of us had been there before, and she wanted to show it to us. The whole way there, we were talking about what we were going to do when we got there. We girls just wanted to relax, and my cousin's boyfriend wanted to fish, so we decided we would head to an area that had both. When we finally arrived at the lake, it was around 2 o'clock. We pulled up next to the picnic area that was along the water and got out of the car. My cousin's boyfriend grabbed his fishing gear and headed down towards the area where people put their boats in the water. But at the time, no one else was out there, not even another car in the parking lot. He had brought his dog with him too, just to keep him company while we walked in the water and sunbathed and basically just hung out nearby. We sat there on the rocky shore for a while, taking it all in, and it started to get hot, so we decided to walk back up towards where he was fishing. We walked up to where he was, sat down next to him. We were talking for a while when he said he had been having this funny feeling that someone was watching us ever since we arrived. We all looked around, but none of us saw anything strange, so we just continued talking about random stuff and looking out over the water, watching to see if he got a bite. And then all of a sudden, from behind us, we heard this really loud screeching sound that sounded like a man screaming, but it was so high-pitched, and it went on for about 5 seconds and then stopped abruptly. It scared the crap out of all 3 of us because no one else was around except people in boats way out on the lake. My cousin's boyfriend said that maybe it was an animal that had just been unlucky prey, making that noise, so he grabbed his binoculars to see if he could see what it was. He scanned the area where the sound came from but couldn't see anything because there are trees and bushes in that area, and he couldn't see inside them. After we all looked around for a few minutes trying to figure out what made that noise, my cousin's boyfriend decided to go fish over by where the noise might be coming from to try to figure out what it was. I was really scared at this point because whatever it was sounded big and like it could easily have hurt us if it wanted to. My cousin's boyfriend walked over to an area closer to the noise and sat down on the bank and started fishing. After a few minutes, we heard a loud noise again, and it sounded like 2 trees snapping together, but much louder and deeper. We looked in the direction and saw the bushes and trees moving like something big was coming through them. And then out from the bushes came this giant, ape-like creature. It had to be at least 10 feet tall, and it was covered in hair that was dark reddish-brown. It had a long snout, big teeth. It looked like a cross between an ape and a bear, and it was coming straight at us. We were all so scared that we just sat there frozen in fear, watching it come closer and closer. And when it got close enough that we could see its eyes clearly, they were a bright yellow, and they looked almost human-like. It stopped about 20 feet away from us, just standing there looking at us. We were all so scared we couldn't move. We just sat there staring at it, not knowing what to do. And then it started making this really strange grunting noise and took a step towards us. My cousin's boyfriend was the first to snap out of it, and he yelled at us to run. We looked at each other. We bailed. We ran back to the car where we jumped in and took off. We drove back to the main road and didn't stop until we got to the gas station. And then we all just sat there, kind of not knowing what to do or what to say. We were all really freaked out, and no one wanted to go back to investigate because we were all so scared. Eventually, my cousin's boyfriend said that maybe we should just go home and forget all about it, because there was nothing we could do anyway. We agreed and started heading home. On the way home, we didn't talk much. We were all still in shock, and from that day onward, we barely mentioned it at all. It was like we didn't have the words to describe our feelings or what we saw, and even when we did talk, it was only to each other. We couldn't bear to share it with anybody else. The next encounter was submitted by a homeowner in Dutchess County, New York, and took place in April of 2010. I was hiking through the woods on my private land, which is located in the Hudson Valley area of Dutchess County, New York. It was late April, about 2010, and I remember that I needed a sweater because the evening air was still chilly. I was following a creek bed which led to a large rock outcropping. My usual route went out on my own. I had stopped at this place many times to meditate, and my children used to love climbing it when they were very small. But I noticed some strange things as I was walking up the hill towards it. First, I smelled a foul odor, like the smell of death. I looked around on the ground for any sort of deceased animal, but saw nothing. The path was clear, and there were no insects buzzing anywhere. I continued up through the stench and spotted a tree that had been chopped down into smaller pieces. I definitely was not okay with any trees being cut down on my land, so now I was becoming angry that someone had been trespassing. The anger turned to concern when I saw that the pieces were placed all around the outcropping in a very peculiar manner, like there was some meaning behind it. I also saw that some of the pieces of wood had been burned on one of the rocks that jutted out from the formation, and there was something in the middle of the burned pieces that I was afraid to look at, but I had a sneaking suspicion it was once alive. There was also a large rock that had been moved from its original position. I inched closer to get a better look at the rocks when I heard some snapping in the bushes behind me. I stopped as I listened to the laughter of what sounded like teenagers in the woods. I called out for them to show themselves, and the noise stopped. Everything went silent. Soon after, I made out that it was a bird in the center of the burned wood, a rather large one. Also, around the wood, written in some red substances, were weird symbols that I had never seen before. And then a voice came from out of the woods yelling for me to leave that place. I yelled back that it was my home and that I would be calling the police. Before I knew it, several people dressed in black came running down the hill at me screaming. One of them was holding a knife. I was scared out of my mind. I ran all the way back to my house without turning back, and I locked the doors. As I called the police, there was suddenly a loud bang on my front window. I peeled back the curtain a few inches to see that one of the people in black was pressed against my window. Their face was covered, but it was the person with the knife, and it was red and rusty. I screamed and threw the phone just as I was giving the address. I watched from the window as the group turned around and walked back the way they came, meaning they were all still out there. The police came and investigated my land. We searched the area but found nothing. I took them up to the outcropping, and everything was gone, completely cleaned up. Even the weird symbols had been washed away. The cops told me that I had a wild imagination now that I was living with empty nest syndrome. I assured them that missing my own adult children had nothing to do with what I saw, but they had no evidence except my words, and they didn't believe me. The stench had not fully dissipated, but the cops even chalked that smell up to some animal dying somewhere on the property. Blame nature, they told me, as they escorted me back to my house. I didn't sleep that night. Knowing that a group like that could break onto my property and conduct horrible things was too much for me to bear. I wasted no time. I put the house on the market soon and moved to my daughter's house, where I worked out my next move. I would never go back to that outcropping again, let alone the house or the property. And interestingly, I spent a lot of time going back to church. Our next story involves a park ranger at the Superior National Forest in Minnesota in November of 2015. I was out on my rounds one late evening in the fall at Superior National Forest in Minnesota. We were a stone's throw from Canada and steeped in Native American legend and culture. I loved being there my first few weeks, even though I had started in one of the warmest autumns on record. It was still getting darker earlier now, though, and back in 2015, I was only a rookie ranger, so I didn't want to get lost. I didn't know my way around like the others, and on this particular night, the temperature was warm, and I had to watch out for the campers who were visiting. I decided to head back to the station earlier than I was supposed to just because everything I had checked out seemed fine, at least on the surface. People were actually outside enjoying themselves. So being a newbie and not really knowing my way around, somewhere along my way back, I took a right instead of a left. I continued driving instead of stopping and turning around, though, telling myself I would run into some sort of a roundabout to get myself turned around. I could get myself back to the fork, I thought, but soon I was beginning to roll over rocks. There was no way around as the road got more and more narrow until it finally ended and became dirt. I was now in the middle of the woods and I couldn't see anything at first except for what was in front of my headlights. I began to panic. I didn't know where I was and it was getting darker and darker by the second. I pulled over to the side and tried to get a hold of myself as I tried to think of a plan. I decided to get out my map and try and figure out where I was exactly. I shined my phone down on it, but the lighting was terrible. I was about to give up and radio for backup when I saw something out of the corner of my eye. There was a small clearing just off the road, but it was pitch black and I couldn't see anything but what looked like a small light or a flame. It was floating there in the darkness. At first I reminded myself that the forest was just a little bit busier than usual, but I really didn't recognize this place where the road just stopped. My curiosity got the best of me and I slowly exited my patrol car to check it out. The only weapon I had at the time was a hunting knife, so I kept my hand close to it as I began pushing through the pitch-black brush towards the light. When I realized I was at the edge of the clearing, I stopped and I watched, squinting to see into the dark for any kind of movement, anything at all. Eventually my eyes adjusted and I could make out several people standing there. They were very underdressed and their skin appeared to glow as they stood beside the floating flame. I could make out the people doing hand gestures, and the light in the middle would get brighter and brighter. I turned around to check for my car's headlights to be sure I could get away from there quickly, and then when I took one more look back towards the clearing, it was empty. No light, no people. I was freaked out. Then there was rustling in the bushes beside me, and out popped a small child in a robe-like outfit, and she was smiling up at me. She had long, blonde hair and held her skinny finger to her lips and whispered, "Shh," before disappearing back into the woods. And now, up ahead, I could now make out a group of people walking away in the moonlight. I always say to each their own, but I have no idea what I was interrupting that night. And from that day forward, I begged to be put on morning patrol only. I didn't want to know what else was hiding in the dark of that forest at night, or who was calling it out.